We're talking about the effects of bullying on children and youth. This is part 3. In part 1, we examined the links between bullying and mental health, and we examined their temporal sequence. So we looked at whether or not children become unwell as a consequence of being bullied, or the reverse, and we concluded that children do become unwell because their peers treat them poorly. In part 2, we explained heterogeneity in mental health outcomes. So why is it that, for example, some children become depressed when they're bullied and others don't? We looked at specific moderators like family, environment, school context. We looked at, in particular, biology. So some individuals will have a risk profile based on their genes, and others will be protected because of the sort of genes that they have. Or the expression of that gene, because everybody has the same genes. And then now we're going to look at why being bullied hurts so much. Sticks and stones may break your bones, or my bones, but words will never hurt me. I was always interested in this adage because it never seemed to ring true. It's said over and over again, but why do we believe it? It's interesting because it's consistent with what the United Nations World Report on Violence Against Children states. They say that there's a persistent social acceptance of some types of violence against children. Corporal punishment and other forms of cruel and degrading punishment, bullying and sexual harassment, and a range of violent traditional practices may be perceived as normal, particularly when no lasting, visible physical injury results. So the United Nations is saying that we turn a blind eye unless we see a blind eye. So we need to have physical evidence that there was abuse for us to be motivated to do something. And yet the neuroscience would suggest the opposite, that there are invisible scars. So I'm going to start by telling you a story about Robin Tomlin. So Robin Tomlin grew up in British Columbia, and when he graduated from high school in 1970 and picked up his yearbook, the official descriptor was fag. So this would be the descriptor that was, overseen by the faculty. This culminates his terrible existence at school. He was bullied relentlessly through high school. Can you imagine picking up your yearbook and this is what, this is how you're being described? So 42 years later, Robin Tomlin is dying of a liver disease, and his daughter encourages him to do something to right the wrong. 42 years after the fact, he contacts the school board in British Columbia and asks them to right the wrong. And at first they were a little resistant. When the media became involved and it went viral, they were less resistant, and they have since tried to find every yearbook and take out this very offensive entry. Now, why am I talking about Robin when I'm talking about mechanisms? Because Robin mentioned to a reporter that I feel like emotionally they've been beating me with a stick for 42 years. So Robin Tomlin used a physical pain metaphor to describe social pain that took place many, many decades previously. And that is what the neuroscience is suggesting, that social pain is perceived by the brain like physical pain. So this does not surprise me. One study showed that people can relive and re-experience social pain more easily than physical pain, and that the emotions they feel are more intense and painful. So if I ask you to think back at a time when you maybe fractured a bone, you could recall it. You'll have the cognitive script, definitely, but you probably won't have a visceral reaction. But if I asked you to recall a time when you were in grade 5 and you weren't invited to a birthday party or to the school party, I bet you will have a visceral reaction to that. So studies seem to be suggesting that physical pain is often short-lived, whereas social pain, which is often what we see with bullying, can last a lifetime. Recent neuroimaging studies, so now we have these great technologies. We can put people in a scanner and we can do these things called functional MRIs. So we can look at what part of their brain is activated when they're doing things. So when you put people in a scanner, you can see that this part of the brain is activated when they experience physical pain. This part of the brain is activated when they experience social pain, when they're being rejected. And what's interesting is within the last decade what we've seen, and it's been replicated and replicated and replicated, that parts of the cortical physical pain network are also activated when a person is socially excluded. Robin Tomlin said it felt like he was being beaten by a stick. People around the world use physical pain metaphors to describe social pain, and it makes sense because at the neurological level, your brain is perceiving social pain like it's perceiving physical pain. And scientists think that the reason that this is the case is that it's linked to survival. So if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, we need to belong. We need to get along in order to move ahead. So we need to feel uncomfortable when we aren't belonging. And for that reason, we're particularly sensitive to not belonging. So for example, one study by a colleague of mine, Mike Rowley at Yale, found that 12-year-olds could differentiate being rejected within 500 milliseconds. So 12-year-olds know instantaneously that they're being rejected. Same with adults. So we're wired to belong. We're wired to feel uncomfortable when we don't. So when we ask people, why does bullying hurt so much? Why is it that we see 50 years after the fact it still has an effect on mental health? It makes sense because throughout evolution, we've had these two systems overlap, and the overlap was important for survival, and it explains why it feels so awful to be excluded. So we really need, as adults who are dealing with children, to not dismiss that reality. Just think for a moment when you were ostracized or shunned or embarrassed. You can recall that moment as if it happened at that moment, right? This old moment feels like it's happening today. And so I urge everybody to think about this neuroscience. It was short but powerful, right?
What reinforces bullying? What might be happening biologically or evolutionary that reinforces?
So when you're asking what reinforces bullying, do you mean like why do people bully others, or do you so are you talking about the perpetrator or the person who's victimized? The perpetrator. Okay, so there's some really interesting neuroscience research coming out in that area too. So first of all, if we recall from part 1, I think it was in part 1, where we talked about bullying is related to high status, right? So high status individuals are attended to more, right? So people pay attention to them more, they look at them more, they validate them more, and the like. People with high status don't attend to people as much as people who have lower status. So one of the mechanisms is that they're actually not attuned as much to the plight of the people that they're bullying, right? So they're less sensitive to the cues of distress and the like. The other thing that's happening, and this has actually been shown too, using imaging studies and the like, where you will see the activation pattern suggests that they're not paying attention to these individuals. So people with power do not pay attention to subordinates as much as subordinates pay attention to people who have power. So that's part of it. The other thing too is that we have this amazing ability to make our egregious acts more palatable by using a variety of different cognitive mechanisms. It's called moral disengagements. So we'll do things like we'll make an advantageous comparison. So I only looked at her funny. I didn't push her in the locker. So I just made a comparison that justifies my behavior. Or they'll blame the victim. Well, if they weren't so annoying, I wouldn't have picked on them. So studies show that we use these types of cognitive mechanisms in order to justify what we just did to somebody. And studies also suggest that we become desensitized to it. So we start small with little incivilities, and then we get used to it. And then once we get used to it, we can continue along that ladder, in a sense, to be really cruel to others, to a point where we may not even recognize ourselves and not understand how we could have got to that point. We got to that point by being desensitized to all of the little civilities up the ladder and using these cognitive mechanisms in order to justify our really crummy behavior.